I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which I record this podcast, the land of the Kabi Kabi peoples. I pay my respects to the traditional owners of country and their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples listening today. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have an incredible conversation with Professor Alberto Cairo. Alberto is the Knight Chair in Visual Journalism at the School of Communication of the University of Miami, and also the Director of the Visualization Program of the Frost Institute for Data Science and Computing. Plus, he is the author of several influential books in this space, including The Functional Art, The Truthful Art, How Charts Lie, and The Art of Insight. In this episode, Alberto tells us about his work with the National Hurricane Center, designing graphics to convey hurricane risks to Miami's diverse multilingual population. We discuss why visualization design needs decision-making processes rather than rigid rules, and why those decisions should be subjective but never arbitrary. We talk about collaboration being essential since designers acknowledge they often don't know anything about the data they're visualizing and must ask experts lots of questions. We finish our chat discussing the gap between expert designers and general public readers, encouraging everyone to get started making graphics when they wish a story or spreadsheet was clearer. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the Smart Community, Smart Regions, Smart Towns, and Smart Cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Alberto. How are you today?
Doing all right. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. I am doing great. I'm excited to have this conversation. So let's just jump straight in. Can you tell us about your background, introduce yourself a little bit, and about your work and projects?
So my name is Alberto. I am a professor of journalism at the University of Miami. My official title is really long. It's Knight Chair in Infographics and Data Visualization, plus Director of Visualization at the Frost Institute for Data Science and Computing. So you need a whole page to write all that. I usually introduce myself as a professor and a journalist and an information designer, because that's essentially what I do. Data visualization is a part of my, let's say, toolkit. I am also the author of several books about information design and data visualization, The Functional Art, The Truthful Art, How Charts Lie, and then the latest one is The Art of Insight. And, I've worked for organizations all over the world. I work as a consultant for companies and governmental and international institutions. That's essentially the gist of the story.
So many things there. But does it all center around data visualization and storytelling?
Not just data visualization. As I said, data visualization is part of what I do and what I write about. And certainly I have focused my career mostly on data visualization, but I tend to write a little bit more broadly about information design, which is the presentation of not necessarily data, but information in general. Like, for example, in my past as a designer, I've designed visual explanations that are based on pictorial illustrations. How an airplane works, or how to assemble your latest IKEA furniture. I mean, I would not design those, but you know what I mean. It's like more infographic types of things, visual explanations. So that's a part of a broader world, information design. But yeah, data visualization is it's obviously occupies a great part of my daily life.
So you've got the research element and the teaching element, and then consulting element as well. To bring that all together, then how do you use data visualizations and storytelling in a general sense?
So storytelling is just in my playbook. It's just one of the many ways in which we can structure let's say delivery of data, delivery of information to a particular audience. Because the way that I wouldn't say define, but the way that I talk about storytelling, I believe that is similar to yours, which is that it's essentially a linear narrative presentation of information that requires you to decide what to present, what not to present, and then how to present it step by step to a particular audience. So that's just one of the many ways in which information or data can be presented. Data can be presented also in the form of, let's say, interactive dashboards or interactive data visualizations. And those are not stories, because those are more exploratory nature, right? Each reader will find their own little insight from the presentation. So how I use data visualization? Well, I use it in tons of different ways, because besides teaching, I also keep designing or art directing projects. So I could give you just a specific example. One of the research groups that I'm part of is a collaboration with the National Weather Service and the National Hurricane Center to try to come up with more effective ways to convey to people, regular people, average people, the risks that they may be exposed to when there is a hurricane approaching the United States. So I have designed tons of prototypes that are being tested at the moment. Actually, we're conducting several experiments on that these days, which I don't do. My role in the team is being the designer, right, the creator of the graphics that will later be tested. But I'm obviously involved also in the testing side, because I need to observe what people get, what people understand, and what they don't understand, and then wonder how to make it better, how to make the graphics more understandable. So that's just one example of the many things that I have on my plate these days.
Yeah, wow. So solving that problem, and I guess, and we'll talk about this, I guess, in more detail around audience. I guess, where do we want to go? The issues and problems you're trying to solve. So you've really given us an example of one. I know there'll be so many. So like, can you give us a little bit of an example or some examples of the range of problems or issues that you work with and that you're trying to solve using? I imagine data visualization is just a part of the solution here. So what are those problems and issues? What's the range look like?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the answer will greatly depend on the type of project that we're talking about. For example, in the hurricane mapping project, the challenge is that you're trying to inform a population that has a huge variety of backgrounds and knowledge levels and literacy levels. They speak many different languages, not just one. If you come to Miami, you can hear anything from Portuguese, Spanish, English, French, right? Russian even, right? So how do you inform such a varied population, right? It's a thorny problem. It's a problem related to the audience, right? How do you present the information to them? But there are many other issues that are not related to the audience itself. For example, there are issues related to the nature of the information. For specific examples could be, and it will sound simple, but it is not that simple. It's a very thorny problem. Where do you put the baseline on a bar graph, or better said, on a line graph, for example, or on a scatter plot, right? What is the right baseline for a chart like that, right? And the answers can be difficult to come up with. So there are issues related to the nature of the data being presented and the types of graphics that you choose to represent those data. One of the things that I mentioned in my latest book, The Art of Insight, is that for many years I believe the visualization community and the visualization literature was a little bit too much obsessed with rules and principles. And the point that I make in the book is that I think that is misguided. There are really not many rules in visualization design, the same way that there are not many rules in writing. Besides a grammar and a set of symbols, what you do with the writing is essentially up to you, right? You can use writing in many different ways. You can use writing to convey information. You can use writing to write poetry. You can use writing in many other ways. And visualization is quite similar, right? So It's not easy to come up with rules that are set in stone. And what I propose in the book instead is sort of like that every designer needs to develop their own, let's say, decision-making process based on assessing what they want to show, who the audience is, and then the nature of the data, the nature of the types of graphics that are being used. But obviously the challenge with that is that every graphic, every design will be its own thing, right? A very particular process that you need to follow to design every particular project. So that's another one of the challenges, right? Trying to assess and weigh the many different elements that you need to consider when you design any graphic. And I would say that those are the main ones. And within those ones, there are a myriad of smaller problems.
So talking about then those considerations, so it's, I guess, a long list, but let's just talk through some of those considerations that you go through, or the decision-making process that you go through when you are designing a visualization.
So one of the first things that I do is, before I continue, I need to proceed the discussion by mentioning that what I usually design are not highly dense interactive data visualizations for analysis. Although I can be involved in that type of project and I can certainly help, most of the work that I do is more expository and explanatory, right? Here's a piece of information that you need to know about. Here's what I, the designer, think that you need to know about this particular issue. Here's how I'm going to present it to you through a combination of visuals and text. So it's more explanatory in nature. The considerations that you need to make, or the process that you usually follow, is first of all to try to think about who the audience is, right? And that's super difficult because, again, the audience could be a very specific audience, and that helps a lot. When the audience is the intended audience for a project is highly specific, it makes your life much easier because you can put together a sample of people from that audience in a focus group. And then you can sit with them and ask them questions about what they need to learn about that specific topic, right? We did that in a team that I was part of. Years ago, we created a visualization for a specific type of researchers. And that's a process that we follow. We first sat with a sample of those researchers and we had an open conversation about them. If someone were to design a graphic about this and that, what would you like to see in that type of graphic? And we wrote down the answers, and based on those answers, then we designed the graphics that were later tested with a different sample of the same group. Now you can do something similar with projects that are aimed at a much broader audience. For example, the National Hurricane Center maps that we are working on, or graphics that we're working on these days. It is only that you need to do much more research prior to the designs, and after the designs, your samples need to be much larger. You need more focus groups simply because you want to capture a much broader and much more complex and much more diverse audience. And then what happens in between, let's say the prior work and the post facto, the test work that you need to do at the end, and this is always an iterative process. So after you do the post-testing, you may discover that that's something that didn't really work, and you need to go back to the drawing board, right? So it's not a linear process. I'm describing it as a linear, but it's really not linear. What happens in between, again, the pre-testing and post-testing, so to speak, is this decision-making process that I was mentioning before. First of all, based on what you think that people need to learn from the graphic, you essentially make a bullet point list of the goals, of the purposes of the graphic, right? I want people to be able to do this or to do that, or to see this or to see that. There are some researchers, I'm thinking and right now about Elsie Lee Robbins. She has several papers about learning objectives, right? So this is what I'm thinking about, right? It's like you try to establish the learning objectives of the graphic. And learning objectives are usually written in the format, my reader or my viewer will, and then the learning objective is what comes after, right? Will learn these, or will be able to explore the data this way, or will be able to extract this particular pattern from the data. You need to do that work because otherwise your designs will be completely aimless. You need to have that purpose in mind when you design. And then based on the purposes, based on the goals, based on the learning objectives, that you have defined, then you make choices about how to visualize the data. You also need to consider, by the way, the nature of the data, right? The nature of the information, the peculiarities of the data that you are going to present. This is something that I emphasize a lot when I teach, that every data set needs different ways of being represented. And I can give you a specific example later. So combining your assessment of the goals and your assessment of the nature of the data, then you can make choices about the types of graphics that you can use to better represent the data to fulfill those goals, right? That's essentially the process. Now, an example of how the nature of the data can greatly affect the way that you design a graphic is, let's suppose, for instance, that you're doing a graphic about, let's say, the change in life expectancy in different countries in the past few decades. Where do you put the baseline? Some people will say, well, let's put the baseline at 0, right? That's because 0 is such a standard, right? But if you think about the nature of the data, a 0 baseline for that type of graphic is completely absurd, because there's no country in the world that has a life expectancy of 0, right? That's absurd. And not only that, if you put the baseline at 0, what will happen with all the lines is that they will become flat, because the change of life expectancy, the progress of life expectancy, improvements of life expectancy decade after decade are in absolute terms very small, right? So just a few years more, but they're highly significant, not in the statistical sense of the word, but in the human sense of the word. An increase of 1 or 2 years of life expectancy in a decade, that's a huge achievement. That's fantastic news. And it will get downplayed depending on whether you put the baseline very low or very high. So in a case like that, the nature of the data tells you, don't put the baseline at 0, because otherwise you are going to essentially flatten all these lines. You need to emphasize these lines. You need to exaggerate these lines, right? Just because the human impact is so gigantic. And therefore, it is better that you put the baseline of the graphic much closer to the lower data point in your data set. So that will be an example of a decision that is driven by the nature of not by the nature of the data. Right? I should be a little bit more precise. It is a decision based on your understanding of the nature of the data, right? Not the nature of the data itself. And I usually point out to people that this type of decision is highly subjective, right? You're making a subjective decision as a designer. Subjectivity is something that scares off a lot of people who come from mathematics and other STEM fields. Oh no, we don't want to be subjective. We want to be fully objective. Well, you cannot be fully objective in this type of representation. You will need to make choices like these that are highly subjective. But these choices, and this is an important point, even if they are highly subjective, they should never be arbitrary. Meaning that when you place the baseline at a point or another point on the Y scale, you need to have a good reason for it. You need to be able to justify your decision in a rational manner to other people that may argue with you about that particular choice. So as you can see, the decision-making process, again, is quite complex. It's very individually focused on every single graphic, right? Every graphic is different, but it's an enjoyable process. I think that this is a much more fun work than it would be if we made all our decisions based on rules or cookbooks or principles that are set in stone and stuff.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that process. And I agree. I think the iteration is really important, because even when you saying selecting a graph or selecting colors or whatever the case is, then you put them together, but then something just doesn't quite work. And if you're following a rule book, you're like, oh, but no, the bar chart should work here because of X, Y, Z, but it doesn't for whatever reason. It's, I guess, more freeing then to be able to go back and change that to suit, because what you said also around like the human nature of the data, or our understanding of the human nature of the data, is also important too, because otherwise we don't understand the data. And actually that's a good, was going to be my question. As a designer, you're not necessarily the subject matter expert of the data. So how do you get a greater understanding of the data if, say, you're just, consulting or just brought in, hey, we've got this data, we've got this problem, what can you do with it? How do you actually increase your understanding?
you acknowledge that you know nothing, and then you ask the people who do know something. So visualization design is a collaborative process. So I can certainly design a graphic for you, but before I can design the graphic for you, I will need to ask you tons of questions about the nature of the information, about the nature of the data, about what the goals are, what the main insights are, the peculiarities, the exceptions, the uncertainty. We will need to have a very serious and deep conversation about the nature of the data before I can even begin designing anything. Because again, it needs to be adapted to the nature of the information. So whenever I work on a project, I usually don't work alone. I mean, with rare exceptions, I mean, if a graphic is, for example, a prototype to be tested in this research project that I'm part of, I can design those graphics on my own, right? But I don't generate the data, right? And in order to represent the data properly, I need to talk to scientists, right? I need to speak with colleagues of mine in the School of Atmospheric Sciences here in Miami to ask them questions about hurricanes and about hurricane-based data, etc., because I don't know much about that data, but they do, right? They may not know that much about design. I do, but they do know a lot about the data. And then if a graphic requires more than static prototypes, if I want to make the graphic animated or interactive or whatever, I usually don't code those things myself. That will take me forever. I just hire people who have expertise in web development, so they can create the graphic dynamically and directly using web tools. So it's collaboration that matters.
And where does data analysis fit in the process? Because I was thinking about it because a lot of the time, well, not a lot of the time, when I'm looking at, like, when I'm researching or when I'm like getting data, I'm doing analysis, then I'm also doing the visualization. But I guess a lot of the time the analysis part has been done and you have to take and trust the analysis to then do the visualization.
Right? That's exactly it. I mean, visualization can come in the cycle of analyzing and delivering the insights from the analysis to a public in two different places. It can come at the very end of the process, meaning that once you know what you want to communicate, now you can use visualization to communicate it. And that's usually where I operate. I operate at the very end. Once the data is well understood, then I can come in and help shape the messages based on the data. But visualization can also come in the exploratory phase, right? If you want to, as an analyst, if you want to discover patterns, trends, exceptions, outliers in your data, visualization is quite useful for that. It can let you spot things in your data that may go unseen if you don't visualize your data. Actually, one of the most famous and most influential books in the history of visualization, but also data analysis, is Exploratory Data Analysis by John Tukey, a famous statistician in the 60s and the 70s. He was a great advocate for the use of visualization, not to communicate the data to other people, but to communicate the data to yourself, to actually see what the data means.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And I guess a distinction between, I mean, I guess it's data visualization, but it's the audience is you.
Exactly. So and I do that sometimes, right? So sometimes if I get a data set that I want to quickly, no, I would not say analyze. It's much less serious than analyze. But if I want to take a look at data set and see the exceptions, trends, peaks, lows, and so on and so forth, I will visualize it, right? Or if I want to see the association between two variables, I will create a scatter just for myself, right? It will be super ugly. I will never publish it publicly, but I'm not making it to show to any audience other than myself.
Yeah. So let's talk about some more examples, if you have any, about impactful data visualizations or stories. Perhaps ones that have left an impression on you. I imagine you've seen thousands and thousands of visualizations and created them as well. So anyone's come to mind?
I would mention, for example, because of my interests, I tend to focus a lot in certain areas. So, for example, I've showcased in my books plenty of graphics about climate change and global warming, just because I believe that that's a huge problem and it's a huge challenge for humanity in the future. So some of the graphics that I have in my books have to do with that. So, for example, there is a graphic that was published in the late 1990s and early 2000s called the hockey stick chart. And the hockey stick essentially shows the variation of the global average temperature of the world, usually between the Middle Ages up to the present. And you can see that there's a huge spike in average global temperatures. The closer we get to up to the 19th century, global temperatures varied. They went up and down every year, right? But it is only during after the middle of the 19th century that the average global temperature in the past 1,000 years goes up systematically, right, up to the present, with very few exceptions. And that graphic displays that reality quite starkly. And in my opinion, is one of the most influential graphics of the 20th century. And because it has been published everywhere, it has been reproduced tons of times, right? It has been corroborated by different research groups using different data sets. I mean, the picture is always the same. It has the shape of a hockey stick, essentially. And then in relation to that, much more recently, in 2017, a climate scientist called Ed Hopkins created a graphic called the warming stripes. And that's a heat map, essentially, that displays the variation of average global temperatures using band of colors of different intensity. And the picture was striking. That's a graphic that has become extremely popular, right? It was all over the internet. It has appeared in the books, in the cover of books, in the cover of The Economist magazine. People make clothing lines with that graphic. So that will be another one that I will mention. And then there is an organization. There is a publication, an online publication called The Pudding. The website is pudding.cool. That's an online magazine that is run by a group of friends of mine who regularly publish data-driven essays and data-driven stories about topics that sometimes are lighthearted. So they could, for example, visualize the most common words in hip hop songs, for example, and they create a beautiful project based on that. Super interesting project. But they also cover sometimes topics that are much more, let's say, newsworthy or much more societally important. So, for instance, a couple of years ago, I believe, they published a project titled Abortion Mazes. How difficult or how easy it is to get an abortion depending on where you live in the United States. And they visualize that not through your traditional visualization types. How many days would you take you to get an abortion? Well, you can create a boring bar graph with that, right, to represent the number of days. What they did was to create several fictional characters that corresponded to many people, who got pregnant, and they represented the difficulty of getting an abortion in different states using mazes of high complexity or low complexity. So, for example, the maze of California is very simple, right? Getting an abortion in California is not, I'm not saying that it is easy, but it is certainly much easier than getting an abortion in Texas. The abortion maze in Texas is essentially so dense that it will take you a very long time to navigate. And they used in that project, first of all, the visualizations in that project are just beautifully designed, beautifully done. But they also use this gamified approach to the project because they force you to navigate those mazes just for you to experience how difficult it actually is, right? So it also has an emotional impact on you, right? You see the story under a completely different lens, through a completely different lens than if it had been represented through more traditional types of charts. So yeah, I could go on and on. I am a fan of many publications out there. The Financial Times, for example, produces regularly beautiful traditional charts, line graphs and bar graphs, but beautifully designed, very carefully designed. Here in the United States, ProPublica, which is a nonprofit investigative reporting organization, they make beautiful charts and great data journalism. In other countries, for example, I'm a huge fan of the work of a news organization in Ukraine called Texty. and beautiful charts, amazing charts. And yeah, there's so many people out there producing great work that you can be entertained for your entire life and get also enlightened and learn a lot through the graphics that you see.
You said entertain there, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot. How big do you think the role is of entertainment in creating, I guess, impactful visualizations? Just to add a little bit to that, I was when I'm, say reading things and they're doing experiments, they're doing studies on different graphics, and perhaps the text versus one text plus graph doesn't really show too much of an impact of changing someone's mind or whatever the case is. However, it got me thinking about, well, would the people in this experiment, this study, even read the text if it was just in the wild? So like the fact of drawing somebody in to actually get interested in, that looks fun, that looks nice to read, even if it is about abortion or climate change or whatever. How important do you think that kind of draw factor or entertainment factor is?
Well, I think that is very important, super important. It is only that anything that you put in a graphic or any tool or technique that you use in a graphic needs to be at the service of the reader and at the service of the information and the understanding that the reader may get of that information, right? So we should not use, we should not just make a graphic entertaining just for the sake of entertainment, right? Entertaining is also another thing that I do besides writing books, teaching, and everything else. I am also the co-editor of a series of books about visualization for CRC Press. And one of the books that I have edited in the past few years actually talks about this. It's titled Joyful Infographics by Nigel Holmes, who is a long-time visualization designer. And in the book, Nigel makes the point that humor is a very powerful tool. If you can insert a little bit of kind and lighthearted humor in a chart, that can take you a long way of making the chart more approachable, friendlier, warmer, more readable, more effective. Just because it includes the humor, the chart suddenly becomes more effective. It is only that you cannot let the humor take over the content, right? The humor is something that reinforces the message. It needs to be connected to the data, connected to the message, but it's a point of entry, right? It's a hook that will get the reader in. Sometimes, when we talk about humor entertainment, people who come from research backgrounds tend to get a little bit wary, right? Just, they say, well, I just want to present my data. You just show the data, whatever. I say, but think about your experience of reading books, right? And I read tons of books, and I read very academic books. I really appreciate it when an academic presents complex ideas in elegant language and beautiful language, entertaining me. Right? Because I believe that it is possible to present very complex, very deep ideas without losing any depth, using elegant language. So if we appreciate that when we read, why shouldn't we appreciate that when we see graphics out there?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I mean, it makes sense once you're like in it, but what you said earlier around that it's subjective but not arbitrary, I think is important here, because I think, if you just add in, oh, well, I'm just going to make this really funny and fun and whatever, but actually the subject matter is quite serious, there's a certain, balance that you need to make.
That would be inappropriate then, right? To introduce humor in an extremely serious topic, right?
But perhaps you can, but in a really
in an elegant way, right?
In an elegant way.
In an elegant way. Mm-hmm.
And I think because a lot of when I'm thinking about visualizations from when I do work in consulting and things like that, I'm doing a project, and then maybe the ending project will the result of the project will have a visualization which is used to communicate with decision makers, public, etc. But I guess I'd never thought about, even when a decision maker, is that entertainment is part and package of it. I mean, it comes out in making it interesting, but that entertainment factor is
but if you think about it, if you can make a message understandable and clear without losing any depth, and on top of that, you also make it enjoyable, Why is that a bad thing? It's a good thing, right? Pleasure, right? Intellectual pleasure is a very important thing to consider, right? We are all human beings. We are creatures that like to be pleased. Now, not pleased for the sake of being pleased, but we are being pleased in the process of getting that information. So to me, that's just a huge plus.
Yeah, absolutely. So talking about impactful visualizations, you've talked about some of those ones that have stuck in your mind, particularly around the areas of the climate crisis and things like that. I guess for impact, maybe in the work that you've done, what impacts have you seen of people using your visualizations, decisions being made based on your visualizations? What does that impact look like?
Well, in terms of decisions, I cannot speak very much about it simply because I don't design graphics to make decisions, graphics for business analytics or things like that, right? That although I teach at companies, I usually don't produce that type of graphic. But I have observed the impact of graphics in my own work among general audiences, right? I remember, for example, that years ago I designed, and this will be difficult to describe in words, so I'm going to do my best. So I represented the results of a presidential election in Brazil. I was living in Brazil at the time. I represented the results of the election with a map, right? A traditional map coloring the areas that every party won. So in Brazil, usually the leftist party, the Workers' Party, tends to have an overwhelming dominance in the northern part of the country, particularly the Northeast. The Northeast is very leftist, votes a lot for the left. The west of the country is a little bit more varied. The south of the country tends to vote a little bit more conservative. So picture the map of Brazil with a lot of red in the Northeast, much more blue in the south, and then a lot of variation between red and blue in the west of the country, okay? Now, you can represent that data that way, right? And I did that. I created a map like that. But then on top of that, I said, what about if we actually add something to these? And what I did was to use a type of graphic that I don't usually use in my work, right? I believe that it was the only time when I use this type of graphic, a radar chart. A radar chart is essentially picture a wheel with tons of radii. Each one of the radii correspond to a state in Brazil. And then imagine that there is a red line, a blue line, and then a green line, because there's also a green party. And those lines surrounding the center of the circle, the corners of that line are positioned on each one of the radii. If they are very close to the center, that means that that particular party didn't get a lot of votes in that particular state. But if the dot is far away from the center, that means that that party got a lot of votes in that particular state, right? So again, it's like, imagine there's a fancy line chart that has been made circular, so to speak. Now, the picture that you obtain for that is that you see a red line being pulled. And by the way, I forgot to mention, the radii of this wheel, like if it were a bicycle wheel, correspond to each state. But then the states are sorted around the wheel, not alphabetically, but geographically, meaning that the Northeast states are on the upper right corner, the southern states are at the bottom of the wheel. Well, the picture that you get is that the red line seems to be being pulled outwards in the Northeast, and it's really, really close to the center in the south. In the southern states, right? I hope that I've done a good job at describing the graphic. But in any case, people who saw that graphic said, wow. It was like, oh, wow, I never saw these this way. I knew that, the leftist party was dominant in the Northeast, but I never imagined that it was this dominant, right? And the way that it was described to me was that it looked like a rope, that those lines looked like ropes that were being distorted by, like, almost if there was a magnet that was attracting those ropes outwards or inwards. And the way that regular people describe it was to say, well, I've never seen this way. This graphic helps me see the data through a completely different lens. And that can be the power of visualization, right? Visualization is not always that successful, right? Some visualizations are not that impactful, and that's perfectly fine. We should not aim to be perfect in every graphic that we design. It's only occasionally that we strike gold, that we find almost by happenstance a way to represent a data set that suits the data really well, suits the information that you're and the message that you want to convey extremely well. And in my case, in 30 years, that was probably one of the ones that was most successful in that way, in that sense.
Is that one publicly available?
It should be online. If you Google
Yep.
my name,
I'll find it.
if you go
I'll
to
put it.
Google Images and Google my name and then Brazilian elections, you will probably find it.
I feel like I've seen it because as I mentioned before we started recording, you are one of the reasons why I'm doing this PhD, because in my master's I got very interested in the books and that you had written, and it was 2020 and 2021, so it wasn't the new book yet, but the Truthful Art. And my master's, I was very interested in storytelling rather than, I had to build machine learning models and stuff, which nearly killed me. But the storytelling part of it I really loved. And I guess also then the different tools and things that then allow you, and these days there's more and more tools that then allow you to, and you don't have to be able to code necessarily to be able to create really beautiful visualization. Obviously there's rigor and all that type of stuff in that, and without that, it's we need more critical thinking when we are using different tools. But yeah, anyway, we are coming to the end of the chat today. We talked about challenges a bit already, but is there any further challenges you want to call out, I guess, when creating these visualizations and stories?
To me, there are many, many challenges, but to me, going back to something that we have already discussed, is that what worries me the most is the gap between what the designer wants to convey and what the reader actually gets. And that's what I have been focusing on the most in the past decade or so. My third book, How Chats Lie, is actually an effort for me to write a book for the general public that any general reader can get, even without any prior knowledge in statistics, and actually learn how to read a chart, learn how to read a graphic, because I want to bridge that gap that exists between, let's say, communities of experts and community of regular people, including myself. I am a regular person. I'm a journalist, so I don't have formal training on almost anything. I'm self-trained and self-taught on absolutely everything that I write about. So I consider myself part of the general public. And we are all general public in some sense, right? A physicist is general public when it comes to graphics about medicine. And a medical doctor is the general public when it comes to graphics related to physics. So we are all part of the general public. So that gap between experts and the general public is a huge challenge to me. The fact that most of us are not visually literate. I think that visual literacy, graphical literacy, and there's a word for that, graphical literacy, I think that is one of the main challenges in educational systems, bringing people up to speed, not only in math and in statistics, but also in the visual representation of those statistics. There's a lot of work to be done in that area.
Yeah. And I guess do you think we're seeing like people using more and more graphics and stories, and I guess an animation as these tools become more accessible?
There has been a huge increase in the use of charts, which is a great thing. And also an increase in the sophistication of those charts. And there has also been an increase in the visual literacy that average people have. That's also something that I have no doubts about, right? The sophistication of readers has also, on average, increased. But there are also there are still huge gaps in knowledge. There's lots of misunderstanding, lots of misuse of charts out there, lots of cases of charts used to deceive rather than to inform. And those are the things that I want to fight against.
Yeah. And I think, the more and more those, not necessarily that they're accessible, but the more that they are accepted uses, hopefully we're then asking better questions about where that data comes from. And I guess with the advent of AI, as well. What are people, what Gen
Mm-hmm.
AI in particular, what are people actually putting into these things, and what is it spitting out? I know I'm following you on LinkedIn. I know you have some strong opinions about the use of AI. Not that we need to get into that here, but I think that's also the critical thinking of us as data people, designers, whatever the case is, needs to, like, we need to start asking some of those questions that the general public would ask, but they don't know how to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we need to, again, help everybody else bring themselves up to speed. That's essentially what I have devoted my career to in the past decade.
Well, Alberto, I have one last question. Any suggestions for listeners to use data storytelling in their own work and life?
Oh God, that's a very big question. Just get started. It's like just think about a case in which you were facing a story that you were reading, or you were staring at a spreadsheet and suddenly wishing that there was a graph in there to make the story a little bit clearer. Make that graphic. That's how you get started in this field. Because every field, every knowledge domain uses graphics slightly differently, and it will be only you who can essentially figure out how to use them effectively. And the spark appears in that moment, right? It's like when you are wondering, wouldn't this be better as a graphic? And then you try to design it. And sometimes, most of the time, perhaps the first graphic that you're going to design would not be that great. But then your second graphic will be better, and the third graphic will be better. You will be essentially entering the world that I have been inhabiting for the past few decades. So it's not up to me to tell you how to do it. It is up to you to get started, and then eventually, if you want, and by you I mean your audience in general, to demonstrate to me how graphics are being used in your own area of expertise.
Yeah, I think like you're part of the data visualization, like when societies and groups and things like that. I find it really inspirational to go and have a look at other graphics that people have made. Sometimes it can be overwhelming because you're like, oh my God, like that's but really it's time, it's thinking, it's testing, it's trying, it's the iteration. And you start with, maybe you start with one bar chart in spreadsheet or whatever, but then you start to build. And as these, we've said, there's tools that are available that can help you then to visualize that in a different way. And then I think thinking about, well, if it's not good, thinking about the reasons why you don't like it, or like why it's not telling the story. And it could be so many different things, the understanding of the nature of the data, the design, whatever it is. So yeah, just getting started, I think, is a great suggestion.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alberto, for coming onto the podcast and inputting your very interesting insights and wisdom for my PhD. I really appreciate it. So thank you very much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you again for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. You can find the show notes for this episode and all other episodes at zoeether.com/podcast. That's zoeeather.com/podcast. Have you got a question for me or one of our guests? We'd love to hear from you. Just shoot us an email at hello@mysmart.community. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you follow the podcast wherever you listen and connect with us on LinkedIn too. And hey, ratings and reviews are always welcome. They help more smart humans just like you find the show. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.